Sandwich Inn presentation for 2020. I'm Barbara Cook, co-chair with Bev Stevens, who is over there this time, for the Book Sandwich Inn series. And memberships in the Friends of the Library are also available with Brad, who is back at the table in the back of the room. Before we start today's program, Nancy Doubt would just like to say a few words. Nancy?
Thank you, Barb. I'm sure you think I'm here to talk about the book sale, but I'm not. I'm here to help you honor a very special member of the Friends of the Library, Bill Plummer. For me, please. Let's move the chair. Bill came to Corning in 1964. 1966. All I know from looking through the records of the Friends is that by 1971, he was already the treasurer of this organization. And he became president for a brief time when the president moved out of town, and so Bill finished his term. He also served on this committee and is also now a present member of this committee. The book reviews started many years ago in the Leader, and I think that Bill may have written some of those.
Yeah.
And I believe the title of one of them was Gardens. But from the time that this particular format started 50 years ago, Bill has reviewed more books than any other reviewer. I can count 7. So, what we would like to do today is to crown Bill as the king of the Friends of the Library. So with a lot of help from Ann Foster, who made the crown, and Bev Stevens, who made
Royalty's a lot of fun.
there you go. But that's not all. You may also know that on Monday, Bill has a birthday. I'm not going to tell you how old he is, but he was born in 1927. So, without further ado, Bill, while we sing happy birthday, there's a cake over there for you. I'd like you to cut the first piece, and we will now continue on with today's program. Thank you, Bill. And we also have a poster over here for you to sign at your convenience. Let me help you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday,
It's okay.
dear Bill. Happy birthday to you.
they will, I'm waiting for her. She's small though.
Now turn the mic back over to Barb.
And now back to Book Sandwiched In. As you know, there are snacks, a few, because it's mostly birthday cake over there. But there are snacks as well as the teas, coffee, cocoa, and so on the counter and on the table. So as the presentation goes on, feel free to get up and get a piece of cake if you want, or something else if you want to have your snack. President Lee Mertson has asked me to remind you that the annual meeting of the Friends of the Library will take place today, immediately following the presentation. Please plan to stay for a short review of the past year and to vote on the budget. A minimum of 25 in attendance is required to conduct business. Today, we welcome Pauline Emery as the presenter of our second review, The Library Book by Susan Orlean. Pauline is the director of our Southeast Steuben County Library. She received her BA in History from Elmira College and her library degrees from the University at Buffalo and Long Island University. Pauline received the 2015 NILA Mary Bobinski Innovative Public Library Award. It's a mouthful. And she is a recipient of the Paul Harris Fellow Award. Pauline has worked in both public and academic libraries for over 29 years, and she has served on various community boards. Pauline believes, and I quote, "Libraries are as essential as air to our society." Welcome, Pauline, as our second presenter of 2020.
So, first off, raise your hand if you've already read the library book. Good. Some have started and say it's a hard read because there's so much detail. But let me tell you, in the library world, you get excited about that detail. So I just want to start off with just a passage that Susan Orlean has in this book, and I think it summarizes many parts I'll talk about later. Writing a book, just like building a library, is an act of sheer defiance. It is a declaration that you believe in the persistence of memory. In Senegal, the polite expression for saying someone has died is to say that his or her library has burned. When I first heard this phrase, I didn't understand it. But over time, I came to realize it was perfect. Our minds and souls contain volumes inscribed by our experiences and emotions. Each individual's consciousness is a collection of memories we've cataloged and stored inside of us, a private library. It is something that no one else can entirely share, one that burns down and disappears when we die. But if you take something from that internal collection and share it with one person or with the larger world, on the page or in a story recited, it takes on a life of its own. And I think what I found reading this book is that she celebrates story, and she celebrates people, and she celebrates libraries. How many of you read The Orchid Thief? So I see more people raise their hands for that. Very good book, lots of detail. Her last book was Rin Tin Tin. It took her 5 years to write the book, research and write the book, and she compared it to raising a toddler. Because at the time she did Rin Tin Tin, she was raising her child. And it was a very tough experience for her, lots of time trying to balance both. So when she was done with Rin Tin Tin, she was kind of thinking she was done with writing novels. She works for the New Yorker. She writes a lot of pieces. She's a really good journalist and article writer. But she was thinking, wow, it takes a lot to put together the information and do the research for a really good book. And she was going to take a break for a while, but then her son had a book report. And he had to interview a profession within his community, and he had just moved to Los Angeles. So she went to the library in Los Angeles for the first time, and she was so inspired. So this book really brings together 4 different kind of stories or plots and ties them together. It ties them together in such a way, and I think when you first start reading the book, you just you're like, well, what about the fire? Because everyone thinks this book is about the Los Angeles Library and the fire, and that's it. It is so much more. It is bringing together the history of libraries. It's talking about people that work in the libraries, which I find to be the most exciting part of the book. And there's some fascinating things she shares. One of her greatest talents is that she sits with people and takes the mundane and makes it as amazing as it really is. The everyday things we do in libraries, she writes it in such a way, it makes it as exciting as some of the big headliners you see every day on the newspaper. She just has that knack. So she ties these together, also kind of covering, was this an act of arson? Because I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'll show you when she walked through the doors of the Los Angeles Public Library. This is the library before the renovations at the top. This is the top steeple or tower, and that's the library burning. It burnt in April 29th, 1986. And there's some of the wreckage from the library. But when she walked in, look at that. Now raise your hand if you have been in the Los Angeles Public Library. Okay. It is a sight to behold. It is. It's amazing. So walking through the door, walking up to the building, she describes that experience, and then she describes the experience of being immersed in art, architecture, sculpture, and then literature, and music, and everything that's contained in the library. And having that feeling, I think a lot of us get, when you walk in any library, you get excited by being surrounded by all these things that are, people's stories. She does say that the library is a gathering of pools of narratives of people who come to find them. It is where we get a glimpse in mortality. In the library, we can live forever. So that's the kind of inspiration she gathers and writes about. So I just love her descriptiveness of that. Now, this building was designed by the architect Bertram Goodham. Goodman. And he got his inspiration from Egypt, Mesopotamia areas, literature, history. It's a Mediterranean revival architecture. It is such a mishmash that nobody really knows what style it is because it has incorporated, Greek myth, Greek architecture, Asian architecture. It even mimics, like I said, the Renaissance type architecture. It's just such a mix of everything, and it works. These are just some sculptures that are in. There's just work of art everywhere. And these are elaborate carvings on the outside. I'm sorry, these slides are sharper. Now, I'm just going to share some geeky library stuff because I think I found it interesting. So when I was reading this, I wanted to know what the square footage was with the addition of the new library, and it's 583,000 square feet. Think about that. Our library is 24,000 square feet. It seats 1,400 people. We seat 94, sorry. But you can just see, walking into this place, just the enormity of the building. There's some stats I want to share here. Sorry. So, one thing that I found interesting too. So, when we go back and look at the fire right there at the top, like I said, it was April 29th, 1986. Does anyone else know what happened on that day in April? Those of you who read the book, what? Chernobyl. So that was such a world-devastating thing to happen. It paled the coverage of the Los Angeles Public Library fire, which would have been front and center news had it been on any other day. So that was an interesting fact that I didn't know about. I can say, in 1986, I don't remember this, I remember Chernobyl. So, also I want to talk about when it took 7 hours to extinguish this fire, and it did crop up again. They kept having to put it out. There was another fire on September 3rd, and they just kept losing parts of this collection. They lost 700 items of material, 700,000. So think about this in comparison. We have a collection of 140 plus items. 1,000. Sorry. You're like, wow. In Steuben County, that would be like losing 16 libraries in Steuben County. All their collections. So just kind of on the scale of volume, it's pretty amazing. It was 20% of the library's holdings. So, yeah, that's terrible. So there had been fire codes that weren't addressed before this fire. And reading this book, this is like the worst thing that can happen to a library. So when I was reading this, you just get these panicky feelings of anxiety, like, I need to check our emergency plan again. and the thing, it was just like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, fire code violations and that sort of thing. I can't imagine, with a building this size, the cost it would be to undertake bringing all those up to code in the first place. Like, for example, we will be upgrading our fire alarm system. It's all that said and done is close to $100,000. That's a lot. Can you imagine for this library? So, there were some articles in the paper that kind of criticized the library for these things. And reading that, I was like, oh, I just don't understand how hard it is. But they did believe it was an act of arson. And so in this book, she's able to talk about the interviews that the fire department did with multiple staff, the public, people that were there. And one of the things I loved most was when she would talk about staff interaction during and after the fire. And there was, when they were trying to figure out who the arsonist possibly was, and they felt it was one individual. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But there were staff that were snitching on each other, thinking, I think this disgruntled employee started the fire. I mean, it was like, wow, those things happen. Those kind of things happen. It's like an HR nightmare. One of the women that was in charge of a collection, of course you can imagine how distraught she was. She talked about when she first started working in a library in New York in the 1930s, the head librarian, to get her attention, they had clickers.
So she would come when she heard her click, because everybody had, it was like Morse code for libraries. And I thought, oh, it's like a dog whistle. It was like, it's stories like that are shared in this book that I'd be laughing. My husband's like, I thought this was a book about a fire. It is, but it's so much more. She describes the gentleman who, we will just show, Harry Peake, who was accused of, or they felt was the person who started the fire. He was such a colorful character. When you're reading the descriptions of him, you can tell that Susan really was so intrigued by his story. And you feel that this just was this misguided individual who just was trying to find his place in the world. And it's really not 100% known whether he started the fire or not. He sadly passed away. So it's just her ability to take someone and make them human. Because when you're reading the news articles, it's just this person accused of this, yada, yada, yada. There's just some facts, there's no depth. They haven't gone and interviewed family, friends, lovers. You know, she did that. She just took the time to meet every single person she could find connected with this person to make him human and to share his story. And so I thought that was just a beautiful way to incorporate him in the library book. And then there's this guy. This guy. So there was, I'll just give the date just because I don't want to, it kind of gives you a sense of the timeline. She goes into the history of the Los Angeles Public Library, and this guy is Charles Loomis. Now, he came to the library in 1885. Prior to that, there was a librarian, a female librarian, who was the director. She was the first public librarian to have her degree and was a director at this library. She was innovative. She was described as just steady and solid. And she was doing a great job. She went to a board meeting, was sitting by one of the board members, and he was their lawyer as well. And he turned to her and asked for her resignation because they felt a male director would be a better fit for the library.
Not surprising.
I gotta tell you, Mary had some chutzpah. Because let me tell you, that's a Mary Ann word right there, chutzpah. She kept coming to work. Which I was laughing through this part because she didn't back down. She came every day, did her job, and the staff loved her, so they followed her lead. And she wouldn't give her keys back. And there was a march. There was a petition with over 1,000 women's signatures. Susan B. Anthony was at the march that they had about the library. And I was like, that's a library director. They don't back down. She was tenacious, and she stood her ground. Sadly, she didn't win. And she did finally go on to bigger, better things. No, she left, finally. All the while, this guy had already accepted the job. And let me just read the passage of him coming to the Los Angeles Public Library. The first outfit Loomis wore on his trip. Now, first off, I should explain. He walked from Ohio to California. Yeah. He was a poet. He was a journalist. His work and writings were in many newspapers. He was very popular. So the board member, who was also the lawyer, who also felt that a male needed to run the library, knew him very well and wanted him because he was so dynamic and flamboyant, and he thought it would bring a real progressive, so to speak, flavor to the library. So this is just explaining what he was wearing. The first outfit Loomis wore on his trip was a pair of knickers, a flannel shirt, tomato red knee-high socks, low-cut street shoes, and a canvas coat with 23 pockets, which he filled with odds and ends, picking up along the way. This reminds me of Lori, I just have to say this. Because, listen to this, he would pick up gold nuggets, deer antlers, tobacco, pretty rocks, and rattlesnake skins. Yes, Kirsten picks up rocks, and so do I. So we're always talking about we have rocks all over our house. He wrote about his journey. When he would come to a town, people would come out to meet him. It was like leading up to this big, amazing thing for him to get to Los Angeles because he was writing about his experiences along the way. At one point, he had a greyhound dog that he happened to befriend, and then later he had to shoot it because it got rabies. It was stories like that that were being filtered to the newspapers, and it was like, wow, that's going to be the library director. So he was there for like 6 years. There were good times, there were bad times. One thing I can definitely say about this book is that there's so many directions you could go into. When I was planning the book talk, and even last night, I talked about this with Gary and his Janice. I said, I had to stop myself because I kept wanting to go, like, find out how, should I talk about the preservation of books in emergencies? Should I talk about library directors? There was just so many avenues. I was like, this is just talk about the book. So, with that, I do want to ask either those of you who read the book or didn't, like, are there questions or things you want to say? I know I definitely want to hear from Janice and Jerry because they have a great piece to share that I just thought was wonderful.
I just learned this. I was like, oh, you're going to talk about that.
The most immediate thing I'll share is that in the volume it talks about the map collection, and it goes into, gets off on a side about a woman named Mary Larsgaard who wrote the definitive work on map librarianship, who happens to have been a very close friend of Janice and I. We both worked at the Library of Congress in our careers, and we worked, she asked us to help plan a conference in Washington, in Honolulu, which we did. And she was a fascinating character. You could do a book about her, the way she went about building map collections. And I have a couple other things to add, if you don't mind. I was actually involved in the cleanup of a major library disaster. In 2004, the University of Hawaii was hit by a freakish flood. The flood only covered about 3 blocks, but did $70 million worth of damage to the University of Hawaii's library. And I was called in as a consultant worked with them for a year to help rebuild the map collection. And all I can tell you is that you don't want to ever be involved in anything like that. So many decisions have to be made so quick. For instance, something you don't think of because of the water, and the same thing would have been true in LA Public because the fire department used water. Mold sets in so fast. So you've got to freeze books. Anything that got wet, you have to freeze them. You have to, there's a triage. What are you going to try to save and what can be just done away with? And in trying to rebuild the map collection in Hawaii, I can tell you, once you lose a historic collection like that, there is no way to truly replace it. And the other tragedy that I was involved in, how many of you have heard of the book called The Island of Lost Maps? It was on the New York Times bestseller list at one point. It's about a man who was arrested for stealing maps from the Library of Congress. I worked in the map division. So this whole book was about this man who stole, and you can't estimate the value of the maps he stole from the library, but he didn't steal them from the map division. as a reference, for 18 years, I was a reference librarian there, and I helped this man, I don't know how many times. He would come in, ask for maps, I would bring them out, and he would look at them. What he was doing was assessing which of the maps he wanted. He would then go to the law library, because the maps he was stealing were in the Congregational record. So he would then go to the law library, slice the maps out of there, and take them home. And when this came out, when he was arrested, I mean, all of us were devastated. For years, we'd been helping this guy, trusting him, and then he did this to us. So, and then the one last thing I want to say is, libraries like the LA Public were really critical to the development of libraries in America. Now, I think I have my fact correct in that 1900, the New York Public Library was larger than Harvard's. So it was these large public libraries that originally developed the library profession in America. And the same was true for their map collections. The New York Public's map collection was, other than the Library of Congress, the first really strong map collection in the country. So this, she's touching on here a lot of issues that very germane to Janice and I, and we can attest to what she's saying here.
There's so many things and directions you could go in, and you know, Los Angeles Public Library to this day serves the largest population. It's the library and its branches. They serve 3 million people. So it's the largest system to serve the most people in the country. So it's so significant, and it was so progressive. It was, you know, doing things for immigrants a long time ago. You know, it was developing collections based on diversity. It was really.
How many people?
3 million. Yeah, that's pretty.
How many, I can't remember exactly how many branches, what, 73 branches?
73 branches, yep.
How many libraries are there in this?
So we have 48. And they have that just in one geographical, we have it in 5 counties. So it just gives you a sense of, you know, volume. Yes.
Was the library restored to its original design?
Of course, they made changes based on fire safety issues. So there were some changes. They tried. There's some things that weren't restored, but the renovate, it kind of was the catalyst. They had been talking about either tearing it down or finding another location, so that would just not be the library anymore. It was put on a national registry to really protect it. And this fire really was the catalyst to finally get them the addition that they needed. So, yeah, that's pretty.
Was the damage to the books and the collection mostly water damage?
It was both. And I think, you know, the CMOG, you know, the preservation kind of aspects of that. You know, ideally, you'd be taking care of, simultaneously taking care of the damage while you're protecting, you know, everything that wasn't affected, and or, you know, smoke damage, that sort of thing. So they had, the community came out in droves and helped move books, helped sort. I mean, it was like Gary's saying, you just have to move. The good thing was they were able to freeze many items.
That was very significant for the Raycow Library.
Exactly, during the flood.
And it was Jack Martin who really knew to do that.
Yes.
Because it had only been done once in Europe, in Italy, and he said,
What we
we've
have
got
to
to
do.
get big freezer trucks, and get everything in as fast as we can.
Yes. So we have the benefit in this region now to Cornell, like in our emergency plan, Cornell's our go-to. They have trucks to help, and there's also services that help with the transportation to those locations. But, you know, it's funny, she's describing, you know, the books by sitting beside broccoli and frozen carrots, and they just had to find freezers, and so they did in large kind of retail freezers, but it worked.
And the fungus that grows.
The mold, mold is not a library's friend at all. Like it's very scary, especially in a warmer climate. You know, you've got to really worry about that. That's why you have to really be focused on the collection that wasn't affected, because it can quickly grow. So that's a major.
Would your assistant speaker talk about our connection to the Library of Congress? Because I was amazed that we're pointing is connected to the Library of Congress.
Do you want to talk about the connection with Library of Congress?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the whole
Oh, yes.
question.
About, the connection.
The Houghton Collection to the Library of Congress, yes. When we moved here 5 years ago, I'd never heard of the Houghtons or Houghtons. I didn't know how to even pronounce the name. Well, the person we bought our house from was retired from Corning. My neighbor worked at Corning. My other neighbor worked at Corning. I figured I'd better learn something about the company and the Houghtons. And in reading about them, I came across the line that Arthur Houghton Jr. had been the curator of rare books at the Library of Congress from 1940 to 1942. I had never heard him mentioned while I worked there, or Janice. I worked there 33 years, Janice worked there about 15. And so I started looking into the story, and I realized, okay, I had read about him there because he donated the money to buy one of the most important early American maps that we had in our collection in the Geography and Map Division, called the Augustine Hermann map. Well, Arthur was appointed by Archibald MacLeish. Now, Archibald MacLeish was a very controversial appointment to the Library of Congress because he was considered a fellow traveler by Congress, and his, those of you, I think you all know the term, someone who had tendencies towards socialism or communism, and it was a very controversial appointment to get Archibald MacLeish in. Well, in his first year, his only major appointment to the library was Arthur Houghton Jr. Now, this got attention all over the country. Now, that was not a big position. Administratively, it's fairly low in the library. It was management chain. But there were headlines all over the country that said, library hires millionaire assistant. And I have found references to this in newspapers all over the country. I've been working for several years now on a biography of Arthur Houghton Jr. And I have the portion of his bibliophilic career, librarian career, pretty much scoped out. But the interesting thing is, I think it's one of the greatest potential conflicts of interest I've ever heard of in the library world, in that during the 2 years Arthur was in charge of the rare books at the Library of Congress, he made the decision to fund the Houghton Library at Harvard, what became the Houghton Library. The whole time that was being built, Harvard kept it a secret as to who donated the money. It was not until World War II broke out, Arthur joined the Army and left the Library and resigned from the library, that Harvard admitted that Arthur had donated the money and then named the library after him. I mean, I cannot imagine a greater conflict of interest. Because at the library, we had to go out and solicit donors. Libraries can't afford to buy all these rare items on the market. You've got to get wealthy people to do that. So who was he going to favor when he went out to solicit donations? Would it be Harvard? Would it be the library? And it's kind of a long story to explain, but I believe that if it had gotten out that Arthur had donated that money to Harvard at the time the library was being built, it would have had an impact on the 1940 presidential election because of the relationship of Arthur to Archibald MacLeish, and the fact that Roosevelt really had to go out on a limb and fight to get Archibald MacLeish appointed the Librarian of Congress. So, few people at the Library of Congress today are aware of Arthur Houghton's presence there. In fact, the current head of the Rare Book Division, when I started investigating this, sort of dismissed him, saying, oh, well, he was just sort of a clerk in the reading room. No, he wasn't. He was in charge of the rare books. He wrote the annual report of what happened that year. He ended up donating quite a bit of significant material to the library, nothing like he did to the Houghton Library, of course, but he was on the library's trust. He was a honorary consultant or fellow at the Library of Congress for 30 years. He ended his relationship at the Library of Congress by serving on the library's trust fund board, which oversaw all of its monetary donations for the last 5 years. So he was, because he had to leave when World War II broke out and he served less than 2 years, he did not have a major impact. But I will go ahead and reveal one thing here that I pieced together by correspondence I found in several institutions. If Roosevelt had lived maybe 1 month longer, Arthur Houghton would have probably been appointed Librarian of Congress to succeed Archibald MacLeish. His name had been put before Roosevelt. The people that Roosevelt wanted to succeed, Archibald MacLeish said, no, don't give the job to us, give it to Arthur Houghton.
It's like how many degrees of
How many days away from the Houghtons? Any other questions?
Well, just a comment that at Corning Community College, the library is the Arthur A. Houghton Junior Library. And when I first came to Corning in the mid-60s, I worked in the library, and probably once or twice a month, we'd get a shipment from Arthur, and it would be filled with rare books.
Nice.
And there is a rare book collection that he gave to the library, and it's his rare, part of his rare book collection.
Nice.
Yeah. And I just had a comment about the book. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and the second, what I look at it is the second part of the book, is the historical development of libraries, and even to the point where she was talking about being on this old dusty road, and with another lady, and they were going to expand a room, and that was going to be the library for this little outlying city.
Yeah.
So it's a library book on many levels.
It is. But it does always connect with the human story. She just did that in such a great way, and it's very true.
When was it built? What about the architect?
It was built. I have that. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I do have that. The architect was Bertram Goodhue, was his name. I know it was built in 1988. 1888, sorry.
18.
I have it scratched. You see it's marked over. Yes, so, and the new wing was finished, the expansion was it finalized in 1993, the finalization. He is. He did the Nebraska State Capitol. That's the only one I have here. Oh, yeah. And what campus?
The unicameral house, the Capitol in Nebraska, it has one building with all the elected people in it.
Have you seen it?
No.
No, okay. I would like to see some of his other designs. That was a whole other avenue. You could have Elise Johnson Smith just talk about the architecture aspect. I mean, and that's like when you're reading this book and you're gonna book talk it, you could go in a million directions, and I did.
Who funds is it the city?
It's city, yes. Yep, it's a city run.
So the city's the one that didn't give them enough money to update their.
Fire codes. So,
So, as I recollect, because I did read the book, but it was a while ago, the fire started in the stacks
yes.
and smoldered for a while.
A while, yeah.
And then did alarms go off and water rained down and.
Finally, the water damage happened from trying to put out the fire because they didn't have sprinklers. Yeah, part of the issue is they didn't have sprinklers. The fire department trying to get to the stacks, which where all the books are held, they were having trouble because there was books stacked on the steps. It was like a major no, you know. There were just a lot of like perfect storm kind of things that happened. The heat was recorded at 2,000 degrees. I mean, it just, and they said a phenomenon, that was a whole other aspect of the book. She went into, fires and some of the research behind it and the science behind fires because it was unusual, because I can't even remember, it was like a scientific thing that can happen, that it's like a color white because the fire was so extensive and hot, so.
Was the amount of damage from that fire, in terms of the number of volumes and everything that was lost, was it greater than when the original Library of Congress burned?
I wouldn't know that. Would you know that? Was the amount of books, was the amount of books that were lost, it was 700,000 items, that was books predominantly, was, I don't know. Yeah.
Just curious.
I think that they lost a greater volume. There have been actually multiple fires at the Library of Congress. The one that's most famous is the one that destroyed most of Thomas Jefferson's library. Yeah, but yeah, the Library of Congress is, well, we had floods in our division and multiple fires, but I would say this one, in terms of volume, was greater.
So a lot of what the architect built were churches, which makes sense because this is very cathedral looking.
Yeah. Oh, it reminds me of a Maxwell Parish painting. When you look at pictures of the interiors and the exterior, and definitely it's on my bucket list to see.
For me, when I read it, what stood out to me was here's this gigantic city library out in California, and how very much our little library in Corning models that library and does the same things and offers the same services. I would walk into the library and I would see somebody at the help desk. I think, yeah, I just read that.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah, I think you have takeaways from it. Mary Alice was talking about, she's like, you know what you could do for your book talk? Because there was a part of it about book burning, and what it takes to actually burn a book and all that. And she's like, you could try to burn a book. And I was like, that's a great idea. And then, I didn't have time to burn a book.
I need to correct something I said. I was thinking of a different fire in the library than what I think you were thinking of. The first great fire in the library, they used the books of the library, the British used the books of the Library of Congress to start the fire that burned the Capitol in 1814. And in terms of percentage, we lost almost everything in that fire. Then I had been mentioning a later fire that we suffered. And the last thing,
Numerous fires.
and to go with your comment, my wife and I have been involved in numerous public libraries, and this is the best one by far and away.
look at libraries, and the comparison to our own library was really very special, I think. Thank you again, Pauline. Next week, our presenter will be Gary McCaslin, and he will review A Gentleman in Moscow. So if you can, please come back to watch that.